Hi again. In William Schnell's book, 30 Years a Watchtower Slave, in the chapter, Who is the Big Bad Wolf? He's talking about the constant attacks upon the clergy during the Rutherford years. And this subhead is Human to the Rescue. When, in 1932, the New Jersey campaign, which I described earlier, began in earnest, it became apparent that the radio boycott would be inevitable. At this same time, it appeared that placement of books was becoming increasingly difficult. The Watchtower thinking and doing were meeting resistance. All this was actually the result of the aggressiveness of the Watchtower. Their preaching and selling of books, which contained many vicious attacks upon all segments of the peoples of the world. It was then that the book Preservation, published in 1932 by the Watchtower Society, came out, and boldly accused the clergy for the Society's self-made troubles. In order that you may have an insight into Watchtower thinking to justify its precarious position in 1932 to 1938, I will quote from pages 66 to 67 of this book, that is Preservation. Quote, "These sectarian religious leaders are made members of the radio control boards in order to keep the people from hearing the truth. And while their spokesman says that his action enables the people to receive an unbiased religious message which favors no faith, he also takes the lead in doing everything within his power to keep the message of the truth from being broadcast by the servants of the Lord. At the same time, the clergy, as barnacles carried by other parts of the government, are given positions of privilege with government heads and officials and with the heads of big business concerning government affairs." By the way, big business was a very obvious and repeated target of Rutherford during these years. The Watchtower seems to have dropped that one. The exalted place given the clergy has increased their boastful, egotistical words and actions. In comparison with them, the true and faithful followers of Christ Jesus are put on the side and are looked down upon with scorn by the HAMAN or clergy class. The clergy, represented by HAMAN, are given greater influence with the lawmaking and law enforcement bodies of the governments and are in position to injure, and do injure, the work of God's people. The clergy busy themselves in trying to keep the message of truth from the people. They even come forward with large sums of money and offer to pay for broadcasting time if the stations will only keep the message that's set forth in the Bible off the radio and prevent the true Christians from broadcasting the truth. This same HAMAN class is energetically having members of the remnant class arrested and thrown in prison for preaching the gospel. This they do by resorting to false and fraudulent claims that Jehovah's Witnesses are peddling without license and are breaking the holy Sabbath by going from house to house on Sundays and exhibiting books to the people. Some of the Lord's people have wondered why Jehovah permits these clergy to carry on their nefarious and hypocritical work of persecuting the humble followers of Christ. The reason is God does not restrain the work of the HAMAN crowd carried on in this day. HAMAN was promoted and then followed his own selfish course, as likewise do the clergy now. As HAMAN had the opportunity to demonstrate his true inherent wickedness, even so the class whom he foreshadowed must have the opportunity to demonstrate, and will demonstrate, their true inward wickedness and hypocrisy. End of quote. There is no doubt that it was the advertising campaign begun in 1922 with books which gradually but increasingly caused difficulties. A clear, calm, and objective analysis of the books, saturated with attacks on all concepts of beliefs held by people everywhere, would at once show the true culprit or villain in the act. But in order to prevent Jehovah's Witnesses from discovering the culprit, the Watchtower used the clergy as their whipping boy. If the clergy were actually as wicked and powerful as the Watchtower Society in its books avers, then reflection would at once cause one to marvel why they did not eliminate the Watchtower Society. They certainly had innumerable openings. But in books like Preservation, by directing its attack on the clergy, the Society prevented the accusing finger to be turned upon itself by Jehovah's Witnesses who lingered in jails, paid fines, were mobbed, ostracized. I hope many of my brethren will think upon that. Now he has the subhead, Fear God, Honor the King. The religion of Jesus has always had high regard for law and order. Allegiance to God and one's own nation are an essential part of the spiritual makeup of Christianity. To be sure, true allegiance to God comes first, but you will recall that Jesus actually wept over Jerusalem and her lot. He did not, in a bitter spirit of revenge and with evident relish, condemn her to Armageddon. Paul said, "Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that are ordained by God." Romans 13:1. Peter admonished us to fear God and honor the king. 1 Peter 2:17. To condemn, therefore, all governments as of the devil, as do the Jehovah's Witnesses, negates effectively the practice of Christianity in its rightful sense. Now remember that this is published in 1956, and during all this period from Rutherford 20s onward, the Watchtower has taught that Romans 13:1 does not apply to governments. That would only change a few years after this book came out in 1962. In their negative attitude towards government, Jehovah's Witnesses have been led to lose wonderful opportunities to honor God. Since I do not take delight in casting unfavorable reflections upon anyone, I will refrain from quoting from Watchtower books which have engendered such a negative attitude, but they are there to read for all who care to examine them. And then finally, as a subhead, no longer puzzled. I could go on quoting extensively from the Watchtower published books which generated organization thinking and gave tone to the preaching of Jehovah's Witnesses and direction to their behavior. Now, who do you think were responsible for both, the Watchtower Society or the clergy? After all, these books, booklets, and magazines were the provender of food in due season upon which Jehovah's Witnesses fed. When, upon reflection, and upon taking a new look at all Watchtower published books, I began to see, really see, how the Watchtower religion worked, it was as if all the organization engendered scales fell from my eyes. I began to see the enormity of the slavery into which I had fallen. But to see it and to get free from it are two different things. In the following chapter, I will describe what it took to get actually free. And that's the last chapter, but one, chapter 21, coming out of the labyrinth of Watchtower slavery next time. Put in a link to Watchtower flip-flops. Vivian has documented this in a video on specifically their changes on Romans 13, since Russell had what amounts to the present teaching on this, and Rutherford is the one who flipped it, and Nora and Franz flipped it back in 1962. That's all documented here in this video. Also, I'll put a link into the slander playlist, which is, guess what, centered on the work of J.F. Rutherford. See you next time.